Hello and welcome to another video. Now, on my second to last video, the one about my favourite writers of all time, one of my lovely commenters asked me to make a video about my favourite Japanese novels. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, if there are any other videos that any of you watching would like me to make, then you can always leave them in the comments below. I'm not going to say that I will definitely make them, because it all depends on whether I can, whether I feel like I can, what I have with me, etc. But you know, I'm definitely open to suggestions, especially since a few months ago I think I reached 1,000 subscribers, which is brilliant and I'm very pleased with that. So maybe there's something that we can do to mark the occasion. Now, I thought about today about my favourite Japanese novels. Obviously I've talked before about the fact that I like Japanese literature in translation. I've always liked Japanese history and Japanese culture, like studying it or learning about it. And then I sat down to make this list, and then I thought that actually, you know what, usually in my comments people tend to say how some of the books that I talk about, particularly ones in translation, are books they hadn't really heard of before. But I feel like with my Japanese books, most of these I think most of you probably have heard of before. I think that's a positive thing, because I think it shows how celebrated Japanese literature is in translation in English markets, and that some of the authors obviously are becoming quite well known over here in the English-speaking world. Which is always a good sign, but it does make me think that maybe I should also look further afield to the ones that aren't just being published by the bigger publishing houses. Because of course there are plenty of independent publishers who I'm sure are producing and translating equally as wonderful work. So let's just get to the list. I've got 5.5. You'll see about the half at the end of the video. Some of these probably are not going to be a surprise for you. So the first book is, well, it's not this book, but I wanted to hold it up anyway. Hiromi Kawakami, one of my favourite writers. You probably saw me talk about her in both of my last videos, the one that's just gone and the one before that. This is probably my favourite of her, but since I gave a review in my most recent video, I thought I would talk instead about the Nakano Thrift Shop. The Nakano Thrift Shop is a really charming story that's kind of like, how best to describe it? It's almost like a love story about community more than anything, I guess, because it's about the main character who works in an antique shop or something, and each part of the book is told from the perspective of one particular item in that shop and the people who engage with that item. It also explores the main character's sort of relationship with the people who also work in the shop, the owner of the shop, and of course one of the other guys who works there, and there's like a really cute romance, I guess, kind of going under the surface of it all. But it's just so, there's something very special about this book in that it not only shows the way that communities are connected and that people can have connections with each other and through items, etc., but it just has a very quirky perspective, I guess is the best way to explain it. It looks at these sort of things through a lens that I guess isn't something that we spend so much time with examining in English language literature, which I think is very much indicative of the difference in the cultures that we both have, and that's something that I love to see. I love that sort of new perspective, and that's kind of what translated literature is about. So that's the sort of thing that we should be learning, we should be seeing through translation. So that book was the first book that I read by Kawakami, and it will always remain one of my favourites, except for this one, which is definitely a newer favourite. And I would always recommend that one as the one to start with for Kawakami. Maybe because that's how I started with her, but I think also it's just the most accessible of her works. So if you are looking to start Kawakami, definitely start with Nakano Thrift Shop. The next book I wanted to talk about, again, not the book I'm holding, but this is just a demonstration. Jun'ichirō Tanizaki. He is a more classic of like the pre/post-war Japanese writing, and like particularly modern Japanese writing. He's the author that kind of is most well known, I guess, in the English language market from that time. He sort of writes about the crossover of the Japanese culture with the more westernized culture, and always produces interesting books. Quicksand is a very exciting, thrilling lesbian story, which was completely unexpected, but very interesting. However, my favourite book from him is Some Prefer Nettles. Some Prefer Nettles is about a husband and wife whose marriage isn't quite going how they might hope it would go, or how sort of like the culture dictates it should go. and they're kind of on the brink of separating. The main character, he then kind of connects with his father-in-law, who introduces him to sort of, I believe it's puppet theatre, or some sort of like traditional art form to do with the theatre. And they connect over that, and it sort of teaches the main character more about his own sort of sense of self as a Japanese man, but also about the culture of relationships that he can have with his wife, with his father-in-law, and with himself, I guess. It's quite a sort of peaceful book. There's something very calming about it. I remember when I read it, it didn't feel too tense. There was quite poignant explorations, but it was done in a way that kind of felt almost like a tea ceremony. I guess, you know, it has that sort of stillness to it, which was very lovely to read and very lovely to experience whilst reading. It's a very measured story which actually, you know, shows the character's thoughts and how he understands the world around him and how that sort of alters throughout the process of the novel, which I think is, you know, indicative of a character-driven novel, because sometimes I think we talk about character-driven novels without there actually being any drive of the character or without there being any development of the character. Just because it happens to take place in the character's head doesn't necessarily mean that the book is successfully driven by the character. My opinion, of course. So Some Prefer Nettles by Tanizaki, I would definitely recommend as one of his works to check out. So I realised that none of the books that I'm talking about today I actually have on me. So once again, I'm going to hold up a book instead of the one that I'm going to talk about. Haruki Murakami, I think is probably Japan's most well-known author in the Western market. And I think he's also met with a lot of complaints, and there are very valid reasons for not liking his work, because his books can be quite sexist and his treatment of women in books is not really that great. If you read Men Without Women, that's a horrendous collection of short stories, and even I didn't like that. Killing Commentator is his most recent one. I liked it well enough. I don't think it kind of satisfied what it was trying to do, but it was a fine enough book. But the book that I love the most from him is 1Q84, and I think that's definitely his most successful book, and I've heard people refer to it as his magnum opus, and I can at least kind of appreciate that. Can't say I've read anything since that's kind of at that level. 1Q84 is a sort of dark, surreal book in which there's sort of like an alternate plane. So the main character is trying to deal with this belief that he has entered a sort of a different plane of being, which is the exact same, but something's not quite right. There's just something about this book that still haunts me to this day. There's the little people in this story, that they were some of like the most evocative part of that novel. The storyline of it is fine, and I think it keeps you invested, but I think what I like the most about that book in particular is the theme and the style of it. It definitely sort of utilises devices that spark my own imagination. So I've always really kind of been fascinated by the way that he was able to create this ever so slightly creepy world that is our world, yet not quite our world, and the characters moving around it are somewhat discomforting. So I think even though perhaps there wasn't anything particularly explicit in that novel, the subtlety that came with it kept me on the edge of my chair, kept me ploughing through the book, and even though it's like 3 novels and I read it in its one edition, it didn't feel like a long read, and it felt like a very enjoyable read. So yes, it's probably not the one I would most recommend from him if people were wanting to get into his work, but it's the one that I definitely enjoyed the most, and that's more, you know, because it's my cup of tea. And while there are issues with 1Q84, I think there are bigger issues in some of his other books. But anyway, the next book is, and this one I haven't actually quite decided yet, so I wanted to choose one of the thrillers from Natsuo Kirino. She had written Out, and she had written Grotesque that I've read. I also read one called, I think it was called Real World or something like that, and that was the first book I read by her. I enjoyed it, but it hasn't particularly stayed with me, and I read that years ago. She also has a book called The Goddess Chronicle, which I really want to read, but haven't yet. So if you have read that, please let me know your thoughts, because I feel like I need to be convinced to buy it. Out or Grotesque, which one is my favourite? I think I want to say Out. On the one hand, with Grotesque, I loved that. I liked the perspective, I liked not being able to trust any of the characters, I liked the way it played with your mind, and it never quite satisfied. Even the ending kind of left you feeling like, oh, well, this isn't what I wanted. But it worked so well, it was very cleverly done. However, I think with Out, what I preferred is the relationship with the characters. Out is a thriller, and you know, both of these books are thrillers. I don't read thrillers. But Out is a thriller in which are they a warehouse employee? Well, they work in like some sort of a conveyor belt line thing. You know, they do something, packing or chopping or something. However, one of the employees, she kills her husband and she goes to work, obviously distressed, and she reveals to some of her colleagues, who are also all women, what she's done. And then these colleagues end up sort of helping her to chop up the husband's body and to scatter the body around town. And then the cycle begins. As the death is kind of assumed and the police start looking around to investigate the murder or the disappearance, the tension of all the characters sort of builds and increases. But I think what I like most about it is that it's, even though it's a sort of these women have done something quite terrible, the way that the women support each other and the relationship that these women then have and the way it changes due to external pressures and forces, but the things that keep them sort of bound together has quite a strong feminist undertone to it. If you read Murakami, you won't get. It just made it so much more enjoyable. And even though it's not a whodunit crime mystery, the thriller aspect of it has you rooting for characters that you might not normally root for. So that one, I think, is probably my favourite from her. And then the last book I wanted to talk about is The Traveling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arakawa. Now, this book is one of many Japanese cat-focused literatures that exist and have been translated. I freaking love this genre because I love cats, as you can tell, and I like Japanese books. So this genre is something that speaks to me at a big level, but I feel like The Traveling Cat Chronicles is the most successful one of that style of books. It's told from the perspective of a cat as he and his owner go to visit his owner's old friends. And the cat kind of, you know, gets to see these old friends, learns about these relationships that his owner has. Now, this book absolutely destroyed me. I was distraught for the last like 30 or 50 pages of it. It made me feel so many things all in once, and obviously that massive emotional investment that I had in this book and the way that then inflicted such emotion within me, I think is a sign of the power that book had, because I very seldom cry in books, but this one made me sob. Like, I got through so many tissues, and I think I like this whole sort of easiness and breeziness of reconnecting with friends from the past, but from a cat's perspective. But it's not written in a way that animal stories could be written, which could be dangerous, is, you know, where they're sort of made to be childlike or dumb or something. It's more just given a human voice with reasonable human intelligence, which I value a lot in literature about animals. It spoke to me, that book, and it's still going to haunt me forever and ever. And you know, can I really forgive the author for doing that to me? But I would always recommend it, and I think that's always a good start if you want to get into this cat Japanese genre of writing. And then I did mention at the start of this video that there was going to be 5.5 books. The half is going to be Mikumari by Misumi Kubo. Now, this book is a short story that has been published in a collection from Strangers Press, I believe. I bought the entire Japanese collection. I've only read 2 of the books at the moment, and I left them in the UK, so I can't read the other ones. However, Mikumari was just completely different to the sort of books that I have read before. It's very much a more like a contemporary Japanese story, weird as hell. It looks into sort of fan culture and cosplay culture, but also into sex, the sex culture and the sex taboo, particularly with age gaps, but it does it from a perspective in which the woman is the older sexual partner and the main character, who is the guy, is obviously younger. It's a very short story, but also quite poignant at the same time. If you're going to read any of that collection, I think that's the one I would But I say that without having finished the collection. But I would always recommend that one, just because it was just a very satisfying, yet fun, yet slightly odd experience that I had when reading that book. So yes, those are my favourite Japanese books. I would love to hear what your favourite Japanese in translation books are. You can always leave them in the comments down below. And so I'll see you again soon for another video. Bye bye.